Last week, we talked about 3 ways to combat self-doubt, and tonight we're going to be talking about combating the compromise trap, or the trap of comparison. Excuse me, not compromise trap. Actually, it is a way of compromising. So, comparison. With the birth of social media, it has just brought out this whole new arena of comparing ourselves with other people and other things. Back in the day, before social media, I'm not that old, but I remember before Facebook was a thing and everything else, comparison was kind of like on a one-on-one basis. You know, I can throw a dodgeball faster than that kid, but that kid can throw it faster than me. But now moving into this arena of comparison, it's funny what I find myself getting trapped in on a comparison level, especially as a father, right? I like to view myself as kind of like a manly father that does fun, cool things with the kids. And then I saw a dad post a photo saying, if you don't teach your kids how to build the shield wall, are you really even parenting? And it was a picture of his kids holding the shield wall, like a Viking shield wall. I'm like, I showed it to my wife. I'm like, I'm clearly failing as a father because I don't teach my kids a shield wall, because I teach them how to shoot guns instead and not hold up a shield. We'll blast through those kids' shields and we'll, call it a day. But funny thing is, though, is we often find ourselves comparing ourselves to other individuals outside of our circle, outside of like our immediate circumference. And like social media in so many ways has been a blessing and a curse, because now I find myself potentially falling into a comparison trap with some person I've never met, have no idea what kind of an individual they are, and all I see is what they post on social media. And then the thought is, as I'm looking at that, is like, am I a failure because I'm not doing what this individual is doing as a father? I'm not doing what this individual is doing as a husband. I didn't buy my wife a brand new Tesla. Am I really a good husband if I'm not doing that? She drives a minivan. Like, that's not the most manly vehicle to buy a woman, but hey, whatever, it works, right? And so as we're thinking about comparison, I just was going through my mind of all the different instances of when I compared myself with other individuals. And then now, shockingly, what you can find yourself doing, especially in my position in ministry, is you can compare yourself with other ministries and then gauge of like, is the ministry that God's giving me, is this successful? Is this how I think I should be doing it when you see this other individual this way? And what's interesting is the algorithm of social media gives you more of what you look at, right? So a lot of what I look at on my Explore feed is jiu-jitsu, shooting guns, and then college ministry. Really like super, it makes sense, right? It all goes hand in hand. But a lot of what I've been getting is a lot of different college ministries around the U.S. sponsored ads from like Tennessee and Kentucky and stuff on my phone. And you're looking at these different ministries and stuff, and you're like, wow, that's what they're doing there. That's what they're doing there. And then this thought starts to creep into your mind of like, am I doing enough with what God has given me? Am I being a good steward of what it is that I'm doing? Or am I now creating this false standard for myself of something that I have to live up to that God has never given to me? That's not biblical. And on the same instance too, not just within the job, but within my family life, and then also within just like my personal skill set. I've been doing jiu-jitsu since 2007, but because of the military and all my TDYs and deployments, I'm still a fairly low rank. And then I see these other dudes that I trained with when they were basic white belt that have far surpassed me. And I compare myself with that. It's like, man, I am just a pathetic individual. And I start to self-doubt, which is what happened last week, right? We were talking about combating self-doubt, and then I fight that, then I get back into this trap, comparison. And it's this constant give and take. And as we arrive at our piece of text here in Philippians, there's just so much incredible truths that we can just extract out of this and apply to ourselves in combating the trap of comparing ourselves with other individuals. Because if everyone in this room is honest with themselves, you compare yourself with somebody. It may be somebody in this room. It may be somebody in the same career field as you, and maybe somebody in the same major or whatever else. And you sit there, why do they have that and I don't? Why are they successful and I'm not? Why have they landed that? For me, it was always, why did they get that duty station in the location in Hawaii when I'm in Fort Benning, Georgia. Why is that happening? I don't understand this. And so as we arrive at the text here, this is going to help us as we walk away this evening with a way for you to, as you find yourself getting into that self-doubt, which leads to a comparison, which puts you back into this cyclical cycle of comparison back to self-doubt, this back and forth. How can we stop and break that cycle and move forward past that? And anytime I feel myself getting sucked back into this trap of comparison, we can move our way through that. So as we look at our text today in Philippians chapter 1, verse 15 through 18, that is what we're going to be extracting out as 3 different ways we can combat the trap of comparison. So I'll be reading from the ESV, starting in verse 15. This is Paul writing. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Now, let's first look at verse 15. In verse 15, Paul says, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but then others from goodwill. So the first way we can combat this is, first point is comparison to others, and this is a way for us to recognize, comparison to others breeds bad fruit, but comparison to Christ breeds good fruit. I'm going to show you 2 different responses that people have of comparing themselves, which brings about bad fruit when you're comparing yourself with other humans, and then also comparing yourself with Christ and how that brings out good fruit. So the first 2 qualifiers we see here in the very first section is some indeed preach Christ from what? Envy and rivalry, and another person preaches or proclaims Christ from goodwill. So we have 2 reactions that we could have to success in other individuals. We could be envious, or we could have rivalry, or we can have goodwill towards what it is that they're doing. So when you think about the word envy, what comes to mind? You know, I think of coveting. People have money, people have a nice car, they've got the rims that I want or whatever else, and you're envying, and jealous is really what comes to my mind when I think of envy. You're jealous of someone else, and you're jealous of what they have, and why don't I have this? And rivalry, if you look at this word, it is an angry disagreement with how we got to where we are at and how that individual got to where they're at. And when you look at this is the 2 biggest issues that I see in comparison, is it breeds jealousy in the heart of the individual towards that person, and that also breeds rivalry in the heart of that individual as well. Now, especially if I'm having envy and rivalry towards a non-believer, which I should not ever envy someone that is not a Christian because they don't have that relationship with Christ, but then now I also have that towards a brother or a sister in Christ, which is also not a good thing either. So when you look at envy and rivalry, that's kind of what I want us to think about, is someone who is jealous or someone that has hate. Basically, what I'm talking about is a hater, right? You got a hater on you, and you're going to become the hater on that person, and you're also jealous of what they have. Now, the other section of this, the positive note of someone who has a reaction to someone else's success, is goodwill. Now, there's a lot of times in which I've come into contact with people who were just, I just wasn't a big fan of theirs. I just didn't think that they deserved what they got. I didn't think that they had earned it. And realistically, if I did a full self-evaluation, I was jealous of what they had. And I said, well, why do they have that and not me? Why is it that they have been promoted and I did not? Why is it that they got that pay raise and I did not? Why is it that they got that good marketing grade and I did not, right? And there's always this back and forth. And then the other reaction that we can have is, man, I'm so happy that you got that. Way to go. Now, as you look here in the text, Paul's talking about these individuals that are preaching Christ from envy and rivalry, but then others that are also preaching it from goodwill. Now, if you look at verse 14, we can see what we're talking about and what he's comparing himself, and who is he talking about? Who is the some? When it says some indeed preach Christ, who is the some? Back in verse 14, it says, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So in this context, Paul's talking about individuals that are preaching Christ, that have been emboldened from the imprisonment that has happened to Paul. They are emboldened with this, but the way in which they're preaching Christ is out of envy and rivalry towards Paul. But yet they're still preaching Christ. But then he's also saying that there's individuals who are preaching Christ, but they're doing it from goodwill. Now what's interesting is that they're all working towards the same goal, correct? If we're preaching Christ, what was Paul about? Preaching Christ. They're working towards the same goal. Wouldn't it make sense for them to just ally with each other and build like a better army, a better team to do the same thing together? And that so often happens within the church is that you get this church that is getting success, and then this other church who's been at it for longer, or this other ministry that's been at it for way longer, and they've got way more experience and way more depth and everything else. But then this new church comes on the scene, and it's just exploding, and these other people are back here hating on that explosion. The biggest question that I always like to ask when I hear individuals having this comparison trap of why is that church succeeding and ours isn't, is are we not all going towards the same end goal of proclaiming Christ? Are they preaching the gospel? If the answer to that is yes, then I need to be responding in goodwill to that and not responding in envy and rivalry. Now, too often here, when we read this text, we could be thinking, that's someone else thinking about me. That is these people hating on me because they're like, well, Ethan's got a minivan. I wish I had that sleek minivan. But instead, what Paul's saying here is he's writing to the church in Philippi is that it's you guys to be careful and cautious that this doesn't become who you are. So the people that were proclaiming Christ is in the city of Rome. Paul is under house arrest. He's been there for almost 2 years at this point in time. And so he's saying that, hey, I'm catching wind that this is happening within the city, that these individuals are preaching Christ, but I'm hearing reports that some are basically defaming my name, defamation, if you will, but then others are doing it out of goodwill. Now, here's what's interesting is that these two issues come down to a question that I like to ask is why were they envious and jealous of Paul? Why? Paul's in prison, right? He's under house arrest. Why would I be jealous of someone in house arrest? Why would these individuals who are technically free out to preach whatever it is and wherever it is that they want to go and do and everything else, they're not being held captive, if you will, by the Praetorian Guard. Why are they jealous of Paul in prison? Why are they jealous of that? And the problem is comparison. They're comparing Paul, who's been just, if you think about this, Paul became converted, right, 35 AD, so roughly 2 years after Christ's death and resurrection. So 2 years after this, how long have the disciples been with Jesus? They were with him for 3 solid years. Now this new apostle rolls on the scene. Do you not think that the 12 disciples were potentially envious of this new upcomer who actually had education? Because what were most of the disciples? They were fishermen. They're people who were doing carpentry and fish and other stuff or tax collecting, right? And then all of a sudden you get this scholar coming in who had confidence, boldness, and Jesus had supernaturally appeared directly to him. They could have had this kind of a negative response of comparison like, well, why should we let Paul in? But that didn't happen. If you look in Acts, you see that the disciples actually affirmed the apostleship of Paul and applauded him, and you see a beautiful response of goodwill and comparison, whereas what we're seeing here is what Paul's talking about is individuals who are preaching out of envy and rivalry of a negative type of comparison. The problem is the responses of these individuals towards the ministry that Paul had, even though that they're all in the same mission. One of these individuals is focusing on their success, their future, their identity, but in the wrong item. Instead of it being rooted in their success, their identity, their future in Christ, they're looking at their own personal gain and their own personal success. That is what's happening. So we're not really seeing a backstory about what exactly was happening, but you can surmise from the text and from other epistles that Paul wrote what he was combating with in this. Now, a quote that I saw rising up not so long ago is that Theodore Roosevelt says this: comparison is the thief of joy. When you find yourself comparing yourself with other individuals, it robs you of your joy. Because in one instance, I'm sure all of you can relate to this. You may have had success in something, right? Let's just say you had success in that you got nominated for whatever position or whatever status or whatever, right? You get nominated for that, but then you're super happy. You're like, yes, this is awesome. And then all of a sudden you hear, well, did you hear that Steve actually just got promoted above that and he's even higher than you? He's only been at the job for 2 weeks. I've been here for 16 years. What did I just do now as I'm talking about that and I'm circling the drain with this is now my joy and excitement that I just had is robbed because now I'm focused on who? What this person has and not what God has given me. And so that is a huge issue in comparison that Paul is talking about is the individuals, if you think about why would you be preaching Christ from envy and rivalry? As if we have done something to receive the grace, as if we have done something to receive salvation, and then we want to tell others about salvation, but I'm doing this in a manner in which that is dishonoring to God, and then I'm also cutting down one of the apostles, right? And the apostles had special authority that was given to them. And comparison, in this instance, is going to eat away at you to a point in which your ability to even function on normal things is going to be crippled significantly. Because the more in which you get stuck in this mind loop of comparison, you're not focusing on what God has given you and how you can explore and exploit what God has given you for His glory and His purpose. You're so centered in looking back on yourself that you're forgetting to actually look out at what God has already given you. So often you get excited, I got this new thing, but then someone else gets a better new thing. Right? I remember as a kid, the big thing that all the rich kids had that I was never allowed to have because we could never afford it was Power Wheels. And there was this kid across the street from me who had, it was the Grave Digger Power Wheels truck. It was like a monster truck. It was super cool. It was just the coolest looking thing ever. It had a cup holder. I don't know what kid's drinking a cup and putting in the cup holder of the Power Wheels. And I was on a pair of, don't laugh, I was on a pair of pink roller skates because they were on sale at Kmart. As this kid's cruising with his Bigfoot Power Wheels, I'm roller skating in pink roller skates down the street, which was very upsetting to me. And, you know, maybe it's had some long-term effects that I still don't know about, but I see this kid driving this Power Wheels as he's drifting before I even knew what drifting was. Tokyo Drift hadn't come out yet, and he's sitting there drifting. I'm just sitting there, man, I used to think that these were pretty cool roller skates, but now I see that, and I remember I took off those roller skates and I chucked them in the backyard. And I remember my dad, who was working, he was literally digging ditches for sprinkler systems. And he was 35 years old. He had 3 kids. He had his master's and everything else, but he was in between jobs and he was digging ditches to which he was barely earning anything. And what little money he did have, he decided to buy me a pair of roller skates. And what did I do with that gift that I was given? It wasn't enough because I wanted that. And what effect could that have had and did have on my father when he sees something that he had probably put in maybe 4 or 5 hours of laborious ditch digging to provide for these roller skates? And I was like, whatever, I don't care. I want that Power Wheels, which probably would have resulted in like a month's paycheck for him. That comparison robs me of my joy when I fall into that trap of looking at what others have and not looking at what God has given me and being grateful and thankful for what I have. So when we look at comparison, especially within the confines of the church and with Christians in general, comparison with other believers breeds disunification. When I compare myself with another Christian, and I am not doing it out of goodwill, but out of envy and rivalry, it will breed disunity. How on earth can I have unity if I'm sitting there very upset because Tyler got something that I didn't get, and now I'm angry at him? And now what if Tyler comes to me needing something, but I have this bitterness towards him that he has no clue because I've been comparing myself with his Tacoma? That's an issue. It's disunifying. It needs not happen. Now, comparison with non-believers is just unacceptable. Why is comparison with believers disunifying, but with unbelievers it's unacceptable? It's because what association does light have with darkness? Why am I jealous of something that someone has who's not even in Christ when that's truly the real thing that they really, truly need? They need Christ. And instead of me going out and being a light to them and showing the love of God to them, I'm so consumed with myself that I forget my responsibility of sharing Christ with them, and I just focus on me, and I just ignore and breed bitterness in comparison with a non-believer. So if you find yourself, and you're sitting here now, and there's someone that you think of in your mind, and you're like, well, they may or may not be a Christian, and you're comparing yourself constantly to them, you've got to stop, because you're not being a good testimony to them, nor are you even going to see the opportunity to share the gospel with them, and you probably won't ever take that step of actually sharing Christ with them as well. So when you look at this, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. Why? Why do we see intentionality for the envy and rivalry, and why do we see the intentionality of goodwill? Well, this comes to point number 2. Comparison fails to remember the source of all success. When I fail to remember and recognize the source of my success, I will immediately start to fall into this trap of comparing myself with other individuals, and then I start to find myself creeping into self-doubt, and I start to question my life, my existence, my goals, my ambitions. Am I really even worth anything at all? What's the point anymore? I just don't care. I don't understand this. I once was so happy to be doing this, but now all of a sudden, how did I do this about face? And sometimes it's so subtle that you don't recognize or realize what happened. At this point in time, I was so excited to be doing what I'm doing, and then the next second, you're sitting there, meaningless, and you go back to Ecclesiastes, everything is meaningless, and you just circle the drain, and you're just like, what good is anything in life anymore? You kind of get Shakespearean with it, and like, that happens all the time, and we do this subtle shift and we don't recognize it. It's because we are failing to remember and identify the source of all of my success. Let's look at verse 16. I want us to look at this. We see different intentionalities. Someone who understands and recognizes their success. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. I want you to see a quick, subtle shift that happens within Pauline theology if you're not paying attention. If you look back at verse 15, notice what is the first characteristic he leads off with? It's the negative, the envy and rivalry. And then he ends with what? The positive, goodwill. But then in the very next verse, he starts with the positive and then makes his way into the negative. Right? We're going to unpack that here in a second. It's interesting, as you read this text, you see that he's immediately introducing envy and rivalry, others from goodwill. And then the next verse, he says, the latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. Okay, so we see here a qualifier. Those who have goodwill are doing and having goodwill towards Paul because they see love for Paul. Why do they see love for Paul? Because they understand what Paul's purpose and mission is Paul was put here for the defense of the gospel. We see that right there. We see that very clearly, that someone recognizes the mission of Paul and they recognize the authority that Paul was given, and they want to support and back the Apostle Paul in his endeavors and what he's doing. Now, as we look at this, we see this kind of Pauline theology kind of coming out, and what he's using here, and I'm going to unpack this later on in the sermon, is a syllogism. What is a syllogism? Well, a syllogism is a form of reasoning that starts with some premises, which eventually leads you to a conclusion. And so what you see the Apostle Paul introducing here is we've already now seen at least one, if not two premises. And we're going to unpack those here in a second. But let's focus back on verse 16. The latter do it out of what? Love. Knowing what? That I am put here where? Here in house arrest. Here in his current situation. Not here like on earth in general, but here in his specific situation that he's in. For what reason? The defense of the gospel. These individuals are recognizing the bigger picture that Paul was actually going into. They understand that Paul was appointed to his position. If you look throughout a lot of his epistles, you constantly see the Apostle Paul feeling the need to defend his apostleship, feeling the need to kind of like reestablish and say, guys, no, you can listen to me. This is why you can listen to me, because I've been appointed by God for this. If you look at this section here, the phrase that I am put here for the defense of the gospel, the I am put here, this is a better definition with a lot more words, is the I am put here can be literally translated as, by God's intent, I am destined to be doing what I am doing by the defense of the gospel. By God's intent, I am destined to be doing what I am doing. Now apply that into your life and what it is that you have as you're starting to compare yourself. By God's intent, I have what I have, and I am destined to be doing what I'm doing for what? And that is where you cross this bridge into the sinful type of comparison and into understanding truly who you are and what your purpose is. When we look at this, we see that Paul is put here for one reason, and that is the defense of the gospel. Now, if you look at Galatians chapter 1, verse 12, you see the Apostle Paul, one of the instances in which he has to defend his apostleship, where he has to defend the naysayers. And what's interesting about this, as Paul is writing the book of Galatians, he was actually in Jerusalem during the first Jerusalem council. And if you're coming on Sunday mornings, we were just actually talking about this. And as this was happening in this Jerusalem council that happened in 50 AD, they were arguing about how and what is it that Gentiles need to be a Christian or to be saved. And then also Paul got word that there was false teachers spreading false doctrine about how one becomes saved. And then the same instance, they were saying that the Apostle Paul made up the story of the gospel that he had heard from other people, and then he wanted to ride the bandwagon, the popularity train, and so he decided that he was going to elect himself to become an apostle, that he is doing all of this out of his own accord, that God's not in this. And so we see here in Galatians chapter 1, verse 12, Paul defends that. For I did not receive it. What is it saying? For I did not receive the gospel. For I did not receive this teaching, this prompting from any man, nor was I taught it by any man. But I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And that was one of the qualifiers to actually be an apostle, is you had to see the resurrected Christ, you had to be taught by Christ himself, and you had to be authoritated and have miraculous signs to be able to authenticate your purpose. So he is combating these haters in the church in Galatia, attacking his credibility. You want to destroy a church, you attack the pastor. You want to cripple a ministry, you attack the leadership. You want to attack and just destroy these situations, that is how you do it. You defame the individual, you discredit the individual, you run their name through the mud, see what sticks. Something sticks, there goes the ministry. And Paul is fighting that. Now, these individuals that you see here in verse 16, they understood that God had appointed Paul to the position that Paul was holding, and they respected the authority that Paul has as an apostle. Does that mean that they had to like Paul? No, that is not what this is saying. It means that they needed to respect and submit themselves to the authority that Paul had given to him by God, and as he proclaims the gospel. Look at Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 2. And this will help, this verse here has so much applicability in our life, especially with our current political climate right now. This has so much applicability within our political world, with dealing with crummy bosses, dealing with people who are appointed over you, especially if you're in a church too, dealing with someone, a pastor or a teacher that you may not necessarily agree with, but they hold the office or title of pastor. So listen to this in Romans chapter 13, verse 1 through 2. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Let me unpack this verse for you real quick in case that didn't make sense. All right? Let's read that verse one more time, and I'm going to explain what this means and the applicability in our lives. Let every person, who? Every person, be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority, let me qualify this, there's no authority given to anybody except from God. And those that exist in authority have been instituted by God. So this is saying that those who are in the positions that they hold, those who are in the positions of authority over you, have been given that authority by God. And I'm going to explain why. Therefore, here's the result if you do not agree with this. Therefore, whoever resists these authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Let's unpack this real quick. And this is not a popular opinion, but this is the Bible. And it's very easy for us to kind of glance over that and be like, yeah, you know, whatever. The government has been given authority because God has allowed the government to have that authority. The government that we have in America, whether you agree with it or not, God has allowed these individuals to be empowered because God is sovereign and in control over every aspect of life. God is in control of every person who holds whatever seat at the table of whatever authoritative position you are subjected to. And if God has allowed these individuals to be an authority over you, your Christian response is to obey those individuals. You may not like them. You may not have to agree with everything that they do or say, but you will obey them. Now, here's the caveat. The second that those individuals violate the standard and the law of God, this no longer necessarily applies. So if all of a sudden the government is starting to do things that violate the scriptures, that violate God's law, we are no longer having to subject ourselves to a perverted type of government, to a perverted type of leader. Let's get even more practical with this. You're working for a boss. Your job, whatever it is, right? Your boss tells you to do something that meets up with your job description. It doesn't violate God's standard. You don't like to do it. You have a choice. I can say no and get fired, or I can say yes and get it done. All right? Let me give you a personal example. I had a boss I couldn't stand. He was an F-16 mechanic before he cross-trained into my career field. He hated my guts. He had me show up early at 6 o'clock to man the phones, in which no one was calling our shop at 6 o'clock, and then he decided to go out and buy a humongous 2,000 or 3,000 piece tool set in bags. And then he bought a rolly mechanical cart and foam. You see where I'm going with this? He said, "Hey, Ethan, you're going to cut out each tool into this foam piece and put it in that toolbox." You don't want to know how I reacted to that. I did not want to do that. That was not necessarily in my job description. That necessarily didn't have anything to do, in my opinion, with what I went through training to do. But was he my boss? Yes. Did God put him in authority over me? Also yes. So do I need to do it? Yes. Now I'm going to explain why. Did that violate any of God's laws by me cutting out the foam and putting the tools in that? No. And for those of you who are like, what's the big deal? It's a huge deal. If you don't like it, come to my garage. I could use that in my garage. It's not fun. But here's the thing, though. The way in which I would like to say that I responded like, you know what? I'll do that because I've got Jesus in my heart. I didn't. I did not respond that way. This guy came in because I had no respect for him whatsoever, and praise God, God has just humbled me and humbled me and humbled me, and I've gotten wrecked on so many different instances by these crummy bosses and everything else. I laughed in his face. I said, not in a million years am I ever going to do that, tech sergeant. I was an E4, he was an E6. I said, that ain't happening, son. He's like, that will happen. And I said, I will throw down with you right now, and the winner will decide who does that. That did not go well. That did not go well at all. I ended up having to go to my upper boss's office and worked under them. And what did immature young Ethan do? Did not learn my role, did not know my lane, bad-mouthing my E6 boss to my 05 boss, like, this dude's a dirtbag, he's awful, I'm not doing that, don't you understand? And 05 is a lieutenant colonel, pretty high up, not too bad. I'm an E4, so I've been in for maybe 4 years, 3 years. I promoted very slowly. So what do you think my testimony looked like? And they all knew I was a believer. I was serving in a church as a middle school pastor intern. So I'm leading middle school, doing all this stuff, talking about, man, this is what God's doing at our church and this and that. And then I'm in there stomping my feet, griping and moaning about this dirtbag boss and how I'm not going to obey him. And I'm telling my commanders, I ain't obeying him because he's a dirtbag. You guys need to get rid of him, thinking he's the problem. But where was the problem all along? It was in my response. And guess what happened to me? I got passed over for promotions, passed over for medals, passed over for multiple TDYs. TDYs were these temporary duty assignments in which all these other guys were going to these awesome schools, jumping out of planes, shooting guns, driving, jet ski training down in Hawaii. That was the one I really missed out on. It was a 2-week excursion down in Hawaii for jet ski training. And where was I? Cutting foam for a socket wrench. Could it have gone well for me had I subjected myself to the authority, humbled myself, swallowed my pride, and said, God has put this individual that I can't stand in authority over me. I disagree with him. I don't like this, but I need to do it anyway. And could I have said that and done that, but still had a very poor attitude in which my testimony was still, I might as well just said everything that I had said, right? Now, granted, the flip side of this, it's just not who I am. I wouldn't be like, okay, yeah, I'll do that right away, sir. There's an appropriate response in the middle of this in which you're told or asked to do something that you don't agree with, that you don't like to do. Hey, you know what? Let me push back a little bit. Is that really necessary? Is there another way I could work around this? Maybe we could come to some kind of a mutual understanding. No, Jago, you're doing it, and that's it. Roger that. Yes, sir. I'm not happy about that. But my attitude and the way I respond can have a huge difference, especially since this guy knew I didn't like him and he clearly didn't like me. Who knows what ministry opportunity of sharing Jesus with him that I completely squandered away. I would like to say that there's a golden ending to this in which I flourished into a new individual and I shared Jesus with him and he came to know Christ. That's not the case. That's not the case. I had a vendetta against him, but as I continued on in my career, I look back and I see that point in time, God taught me such a valuable lesson about authority and subjecting and respecting the authority of those over me and not usurping them and not pushing back on them. So as we look at this, the latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. These individuals see the authority that Paul has and the response that they could have had, like what I had, they did not have that. Instead, they had goodwill and love towards Paul because they see that Paul was doing this for the benefit of the spreading of the gospel. And so it's so interesting when we look at this, we have to understand this. And I think this is going to be on the screen. You are exactly where you are because God has allowed you to be there to serve under who you are serving under. Because what's interesting is after that station, I went to another station in which I went to retrain into a different career field. And I showed up there and I got humbled there. I got injured, had to go back to that base again after getting injured and not passing that. Then I get moved to another duty station in which I had to deal with another bigger boss who would actually have completely ruined my career if he had the opportunity to. But I had started to smarten up a little bit, and so I held my tongue. And I subjected myself to the authority. And then as I continued on and I continued on, I started to realize whatever it is and wherever it is that I'm at, God has allowed me to be there, and God has allowed me to serve under the individual or be subservient to the individual in whom I am serving. Why? I may not know. Now, about 8-9 years later, I can look back and say, okay, now I know why God allowed me to serve under this individual. Now I know why God had me go through all of this horrific stuff because of what it has taught me that I am teaching my family, that I'm teaching my kids, and that I'm hopefully trying to explain to you all on how you should not be responding to authority figures over you in disrespect. Because what I didn't realize is that in the military, you have no rights. You sign those away. I can't say or do anything that I want to do on my own free will. You want free will? Get out of the military. And when I got out of the military, that's why I grew a beard, and I grew my hair. That's the first thing everybody does if they're able to. So what we see here in verse 16 is these individuals recognize the authority of the Apostle Paul. Did they have to like the Apostle Paul? No. They probably still hated the Apostle Paul for killing Stephen. They probably hated the Apostle Paul for going from a guy who crushed the church to being a leader who planted several churches. You want to talk about hate? That's the kind of hate that I think would be very prevalent within this realm, as the church had literally just started and everyone's kind of jockeying, because this is kind of how human psychology is. Power. I want this position. I want this position. I want this notoriety. I want this. I want people to come and bow at my feet. I want people to come, oh, Ethan, we want to hear what you have to say. But then all of a sudden, this dude out of nowhere rises up like, hey, I got you, fam. Guys, let's go this way, figure it out. No. And so these individuals, though, responded in love. Now the next verse, verse 17, the former proclaim Christ. Now we're going back to the beginning of verse 15, those who preach Christ from envy and rivalry. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. Looking at this verse, you see a very description in which you can almost feel kind of the emotion of the Apostle Paul, as you can tell it hurts him. That these individuals who are claiming to be preachers, claiming to be ministers of the word, are preaching this out of selfish ambition to hurt the Apostle Paul, to hurt the ministry of the Apostle Paul, to probably discredit the Apostle Paul. Now, here's indications that we may be too self-focused that I can glean out of this section of the text here. One, if I'm so self-focused, I'm probably using the platform for promotion of self. Am I promoting myself in everything that I'm doing? And then number two indication, if I'm being self-focused, is I'm not content, or I'm not being content with what I have. So in instance one, I'm using my platform or the platform or the authority that I've been giving to promote myself. And in the same instance, I'm not being content with what I actually do have. Instead of me looking at what I don't have, how about I just look at what I do have? As we look at this verse here in the text, the former proclaimed Christ out of selfish ambition. That is the intentionality of putting yourself forward by working situations and scenarios for self-glorification. That same boss I was telling you about, we would have IG inspections. It was these, I don't know really who they were, but these big ranked people would come and would inspect the shop and would inspect everything. And so he'd all say, all right, guys, go do work. And he would sit on his computer and watch YouTube. The second we found out that the guys were entering into the building, as we're sitting there scrubbing or doing whatever else, he gets out there scrubbing. Oh, hey, guys, you just came in. So looking like he was doing all of this work, manipulating the situation so that way he got the glorification. And what do you think my response was? I'm going to take this mop right across your head. No. At that point in time, I realized that's not going to help me out. But what am I doing right now? What are you doing right now in which you're manipulating a situation to promote yourself and to glorify yourself for the intentionality of putting someone else down while I'm elevating myself up? That is what these individuals were doing, and how dare they use the gospel to be doing it that way? There's a lot of individuals that I've talked to that say, you know what? I think I want to go into ministry. And I say, well, why? They said, I think it would be fun to stand in front of a bunch of people and to kind of talk, and people would want to hear what I have to say. That is scary. You get a pastor in the pulpit who is self-focused, or a person in the pulpit that is teaching or preaching that only cares about how they appear to the world or how people perceive them. Do you think the focus is going to be on the scripture? Or do you think the focus is going to be, look how great I am? That's why so often I just keep myself in check by telling all of my failures. I don't want you guys to ever think that I think I'm some worthy person, because I am not. Not at all. The pastor humbles himself to be able to stand here to preach God's word. I work for you. I work for you. You don't work for me. And when these individuals were using the office and the command we've been giving to share and carry the gospel for their own selfish ambition, that is scary. But yet people tend to be trend chasers. And at that time, think about the explosion of the church. It went from 120 people to 3,000 people. And the text says, and the Lord continued to add their number day by day. At this point in time, the church was in hundreds of thousands, right? Huge, exploded, brand new religion on scene, and it's exploded. And who do you think is getting the attention? The apostles. And these people who are down and out are seeing these apostles get all this fame and recognition. I could act like that. I'm just going to listen to what they're saying and regurgitate what they're saying. And then because I've never actually been trained, my regurgitation is going to start slipping from God focus, slipping from what God's focus is, and then now me, then me, then me. And it stops talking and having a God-centric message to a man-centric message. So when you're listening to someone preaching, one way to recognize a false teacher is who's the subject of their preaching and teaching. Is it Christ or is it themselves? And so what's happening here is they were using this platform of Christ to promote themselves. When we look at people creating or building a platform for themselves, we've got to be cautious about who it is that we as consumers tend to follow. Here's a statistic for you. At the age of technology that we live in, 88% of millennials and Gen Z get their advice on purchases and beliefs from social media. Think about the last thing you purchased. Those Amazon, Instagram ads get me all the time. I get stuff delivered to the house and Diane's like, what did you find now? I'm like, look at this. It's this star thing you plug in and it puts the constellations on the ceiling. It's cool. The kids will love it. It affects me. I'm still a 14-year-old at heart buying stuff that I wish I had as a kid. I don't even know where that star constellation thing is. It's probably deep buried in a closet somewhere. But think about it. Social media affects my purchase habits, affects your purchase habits, but also your belief habits. You start scrolling through an algorithm, you start seeing one person teaching a certain way, Instagram's going to read that, and now all you're going to be seeing is that same kind of message, and your mind's going to start assuming, oh, this is truth, this is truth, this is truth, because that's all I'm seeing here. So, how do we get to become an influencer? How do we get to be able to do that, which a lot of people are trying to promote themselves? I've got 6 easy steps, if you wanted to get into that. 1, identify your niche. In this instance, these individuals were identifying religion. That's the niche that these individuals who are proclaiming Christ out of selfish ambition, they identified their niche. Then they picked their platform. Their platform was preaching. Their platform was teaching. Their platform was traveling. Then they created content. Doesn't matter if it's true. It just has to sound reasonable. I'm going to just kind of throw stuff out there, maybe throw the name of Jesus in every now and then. But when I'm saying Jesus, I'm not actually talking about Christ. I'm talking about, I don't know, it could be Spider-Man. It doesn't matter. I'm just throwing something out there, but I'm relabeling it as Jesus. So pick your content, create it. Then I'm going to engage my audience. Go out there and herald. These individuals, if you actually start researching this, these individuals were heralds. These individuals would travel, and they would teach, and they would be false teachers. And that is why the New Testament, you always hear this reference of false teachers. That is what was happening. They were following this kind of trend, if you will. Then, step 5, they would be consistent in their message. Me focused. You are never going to be as good as me, but if you put money and you plant your faith seed in my ministry, maybe you'll be blessed when I get blessed. All right? And then the last step, there's more to this, but I boiled it down to 6. I'm going to collaborate with other influencers. It's okay to compromise my beliefs for this. Now, what's sad about that is a lot of individuals who are trying to create a platform, specifically within ministry and preaching, are going to compromise because they're comparing themselves and they're going to start collaborating with individuals they should never be collaborating with in the first place. Well, why? When you see someone who had a solid teaching ministry, and then all of a sudden you see them up on stage sharing it with somebody else, and they're talking together like they're best buds, you're like, holy smokes, dude. Why are you with that person? That dude's as false teacher as they come. He's got a shirt that says false teacher, and you're sharing a stage with him. Well, I need to get my platform up there. Like, I don't really agree with everything they're saying, but, we can at least agree on the centrality of the gospel. That I don't think that person could describe their way out of a paper bag about what the gospel is, but you compromise yourself because you're comparing yourself with the success of others, and you want that success for yourself, so you compromise. Now, you may not be this individuals that you see here about preaching Christ from selfish ambition, but what you could be doing, and what you are probably doing, is compromising yourself to be hanging out with people you shouldn't be hanging out with, doing things that you shouldn't be doing, and compromising your testimony because you want to be liked by others. I was in Destin today with several other pastors. As we were driving back, we were talking about this individual's daughter she's 13 and she wants a cell phone so bad, but him and his wife do not think that it's healthy because all the kids are these TikTok stars and they're gaining momentum and they're gaining this fame. And they said that we don't think we should do it. And they were asking me, what do you think they should do? I said, the second your kid starts to see these girls and these kids having success and fame on TikTok, they're going to compare themselves, well, why don't I have this stuff? And they're going to start compromising their belief system and values to mimic what they see as getting success and getting trends. And so this 12-year-old girl, in 4 years, who knows what she could be doing? In 6 years, who knows what she could be doing? Because she's consistently developing this trend and this habit of consistent compromise to be liked by others. The way in which our minds and our psychology is built is we want to be liked by people. If that's not the case, then why is there the heart button or the like button? We want to be affirmed by other individuals, and so we will compromise our beliefs, we will compromise our minds, we will compromise who we are to get that edification and that self-glorification from me. If you don't believe me, look at your news feed or look at your feed and be like, man, that's some legit content. I got 3 likes. But then this other dude posted a dancing chick and they got 500. And you're comparing yourself, well, I'm going to compromise because I want to get to that. Be yourself. And what's sad is in this instance, in verse 17, these individuals are exactly, think about the social media influencers back in the first century preaching and teaching Christ. Other people, as the message was still spreading around, other people were easily deceived, very easily deceived. And they're not doing this in a sincere manner. Well, how do I know that? In verse 17b, it says, not sincerely proclaiming Christ, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. They were proclaiming Christ for self-promotion and to afflict an attempt to cause harm to the Apostle Paul. They're probably even stating this, there must be some sin in Paul's life. That's why he's imprisoned. He's not doing exactly what God wants him to do. That's why he's in there. I told you Paul isn't trustworthy. Look, he's on guard by the Praetorians. That means he's a very bad dude. He only cares about growing his influence. So he got himself arrested and demanded to be tried by Caesar. That's why he's in Rome. He's doing that to promote his ministry, his following. I can guarantee you that's probably something that had happened. And so we see this in verse 17. This is what they're doing. So then what happens? What is the big problem with all of comparison? That's point 3. Comparison steers us off our true mission. When I start to find myself comparing myself, I'm so focused on this that I'm forgetting truly what it is that I'm put on this earth to do. I'm forgetting what it is that I am supposed to be moving towards. In verse 18, let's look at this. He says all of this stuff. He says all of this, thinking to afflict me. And then he says this in verse 18. I love this. What then? Think about that. Let me read this how the Apostle Paul, verse 17. The former proclaimed Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Who cares? That's what he's saying. Whatever. Not a big deal. What then? Well, only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. So let me break down this Pauline theology syllogism for you. Here's what's interesting. The syllogism, remember, it's a premise, conclusion. Here's premise 1. Christ is preached, right? Christ is preached. And this should be up on the screen. There we go. Christ is preached. Premise 2, some preach Christ with bad intentions. Premise 3, some preach Christ with good intentions. But what's the conclusion? Christ is still preached. How you get to that end doesn't matter because Christ is still preached. Paul's not taking this personally and taking the attacks. If anything, he's like, fine, shoot those darts at me, crush me. I don't care as long as Christ is being preached. Hey, I'll take that heat. I'll take that hate. It doesn't matter. As long as Christ is being proclaimed, as long as Christ is being preached, that is the only thing that I care about. That is the only thing that Paul deems important. Notice at this point in time, he doesn't say, guys, no, I want to let you know that I'm not, this and this and this. No, he doesn't care. He does not compare himself with others. He doesn't compare himself with his haters. He doesn't say, this is why I'm better than those people. He says, I don't care. Christ is proclaimed. And you, church in Philippi, you guys need to be encouraged. Don't worry about these naysayers. Don't worry about these people talking trash about me. Christ is being proclaimed. Hey, who cares? It's getting the job done, right? Here's something I want you guys to think about. Comparison affects how we perceive ourselves and the world around us. It will control our feelings of worth. It will skew our thoughts, and it will diminish our contentment. It affects how we perceive ourselves and the world around us. It controls my feelings of worth. It changes my thoughts, and it diminishes my contentment. As Paul's unpacking here, as he sees here, he doesn't care what is happening to him He's not taking this personally. He doesn't care that they're preaching a message against Paul because at least Christ is still being proclaimed. If I have to deal with this, so be it, as long as Christ is being preached, as long as Christ is being proclaimed. He does not need to care, he does not care about their criticisms and the conflicts as much as he is caring about the message of Christ and the message that he has been put for. And guys and girls, we need to be prepared for this. We need to be prepared to take this heat. We need to be prepared to be attacked. It's going to happen. You're going to have naysayers. You're going to have haters. You're going to have people saying, well, you're doing that only because you want people to think you're a good person. Or you're doing that because you're just trying to get in good with the boss. Or you're just doing that because this and this. It always is hard for me when you genuinely meet a super nice and sincere person. I always think that they're strategizing for something. When you meet that just over bubbly nice person, you're like, what are you gaming for? No one just likes me for me. There's no way you just like me because I'm no. Maybe my wife. Thank you, Diane. I needed that affirmation from you. But how often do we fall into that trap? And when someone's being nice to us, we're like, what is it that you want? And I usually say that to you, especially if someone comes up to me, hey, what's up, man? What is it? What do you need? Oh, can I just borrow your truck for a couple? And so when we look at this, we need to see that we are not to be concerned with all of this outside stuff. I don't need to be concerned with the criticisms that I get. I need to be content with what I have, and I need to be content with what I am doing for Christ. And if other people are hating me, and other people are judging me because I'm being nice, and they're asking, well, why are you doing that? I need to be able to defend myself by only defending the gospel. Like, look, this is what Jesus has done for me, and I may look like a weird guy, and I may just be overly nice, but I just love Jesus, man, and I want you to know who Jesus is too. I mean, it may not be as that corny of a roundabout way of talking to them about, but like you are going to have a time in which you're going to have to defend the gospel. You're going to have to defend the gospel from the naysayers, but at the same time, I don't need to feel the point and the burden to defend myself as long as Christ is being proclaimed. Ethan, you're a weird dude, but you clearly love Jesus. I've never had anyone say that to me, but hey, awesome, dude. Yes, I do love Jesus. Would you like to know more about him? So we as Christians are called to be confident. We are called to be bold. We are called to know what we believe, know what we affirm in the scriptures, and know that my life is not my own. I was bought with a price. I've been put here for a reason. God is in control. I'm exactly where I am at the point in time in which I am currently sitting in, and that I need to wait on God as God is going to move me forward and not get bogged down with comparison. The biggest thing that we need to be walking away with is being content. Contentment comes when we fix our eyes on Jesus, when we have joy in any circumstance, when we trust that he is in total control. As you read through this passage here, notice how many times Christ is being mentioned. Right? We see the word I one time in these 3 verses. We see Christ's name 3 times. So that demonstrates the importance of what Paul is truly concerned with. Christ, not I. And when we are content with where we're at, and in this instance, Paul was content in house arrest, being guarded by Romans, he's content with that. I can be useful for God. I can be useful for him because my mind's free and cleared up, and I'm not worried about all this background noise. I can concentrate on what God has told me to do. And this temptation of comparison can creep in every aspect of my life in the most benign way, can creep in, plant the seed, and then that seed of discontentment begins to grow and fester. Why does he have that? Why do I have nothing? Why does she get that? Why does she have this? Why does he get that? And it begins to creep in, and then that begins to have bitterness and resentment. So, what and how can we combat the comparison trap? Well, one, we have to recognize that comparison to others breeds bad fruit. Comparison to Christ, however, breeds good fruit. It is encouraging for us to compare ourselves with Christ. 2, comparison fails to remember the source of all the success that you have ever had. As minuscule as it may be, anything that you have is given to you by God. The shoes that you're wearing right now was given to you by God. If God didn't give you the ability to walk, talk, speak, do whatever it is you could do, you would never have the money to afford that. Everything that you have is from God. And then number three, comparison steers us off our true mission, and we've got to be content with what we have, where we're at, and wait on the Lord. The hardest thing for us as Christians to do, besides being consistently in God's word, is being content with where God has you. That is the hardest thing. And I'm right there with you. It is so hard to accept and be okay that where I'm at right now is not where I want to be, but I've got to be okay with it because I know that God is in control. I know that God is sovereign, and God is going to move me forward when he wants to. All right? So as I pray, here's what I want to do. I want to have all my leaders and all my discipleship leaders come forward, and I'm going to pray, and then after I close in prayer, if you are going through something in which you're not content, in which you're struggling with, I don't know where to go, I'm so frustrated, I need help, I'm comparing myself with other people, I don't know which way is up, I don't know which way to go forward, we want to pray with you. Let us pray with you. The best thing, whenever I find myself in these situations of not being content or comparing myself, is to pray. And to pray with other believers. You don't have to share all these details. Just come and be like, can you just pray with me? I want to be content with what I have. I want to be content with where I'm at. I don't feel that way, but I want God to help me out. Let's pray.